Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About It. I hope everybody's having a wonderful holiday season. And do we have fabulous guests for you this evening? Isn't that right, Dennis?
Yes, Susan.
Yes.
Yes, I agree.
Well, I'm so glad to have you agree. It shows that he's in the holiday spirit.
Well, these are two of our favorite guests from all time, from 25 years on the air.
At least, yes. We are so honored, and it's just a wonderful show that we have for you tonight.
End of the year.
End of the year show, and we have Jamie Eves, who has done amazing work in our town, being one of the best historians we've ever had, I think. And
the best.
Yes.
Definitely.
And he's going to be here to tell us some interesting things about the area and the Civil War era. And we have Kit Eves, his wife, who has done great work in town, and both are Lions, and Dennis and I are members of the Lions Club, and they do great things to help the people here in the area.
We're nominally Lions.
But anyway, without further ado, welcome to the show, Jamie Eves.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And
Thank
you. Welcome, Kit
Thank you.
Eves. Okay.
My voice is the same. Jamie's is different as he's gotten a little older, so you may not recognize his voice. But
He sounded good when he said hello.
Yes, he sounds
I thought
great.
That was good.
Excellent.
And,
Tell us a little bit about what you plan to talk to us about this evening, Jamie.
Well, I was asked to tell the story of the Methodist melee on Main Street, which is a story of two and more local heroes who stand up to a mob in the 1830s to protect the rights of an abolitionist speaker.
Wow, that is fabulous.
Methodist melee on Main Street. That's illiterate.
And as a
See,
historic,
I did go to school.
yeah, and
Anyway.
my family, I come
No,
from
I
a
heard
long
of
line.
I saw it on Facebook.
I come from a long line of Methodists.
Yeah, good for you. I was raised as a
where
Catholic.
was the Methodist Church on Main Street? I still don't know.
It's approximately where Hurley's was.
Oh, yes.
Oh.
I'm not sure what to call that building today, but
Yeah, they called it a lot of things.
yeah.
The Lincoln.
Well, now it's the Hurley's building has now been done over by beautiful, great work. People like Barbara McGrath and a number of people have done that building over, and now it's
Sure looks nice.
Yeah, it's good beat. So that's where the event took place.
Well, when there was a different church that was there. So the Methodists were not the first or anywhere near the first church to be formed here locally. Congregational church goes back to colonial times. But the Methodist Church was created here in the town of Windham in the 1830s. And that's pretty late. There were several that were already here before that. And its first building was on Main Street. And then they moved around the corner to Church Street, named because their church was there, where they were for forever, the longest time, until urban renewal in the 1970s. And then they moved actually out of Windham across the border into Mansfield. But it's the same church, so it's got a long history.
That's interesting.
Is that the church that's on Route 195 on the left-hand side?
Yep, that's the
Going up,
that's
not
the one.
too far out of town?
Yep, that's
yeah,
it.
Okay.
my Aunt Clarine was a Methodist minister. She was the first woman to graduate from the Hartford Seminary in 1938. And the reason I mention that is because we saw her give a sermon at that particular church back in the day. It's probably
Okay.
about 25 years ago now. But also we have the Methodist Camp Meeting Ground here in town.
We do.
And that is another place. They've changed it to just Camp Meeting Ground. But when they had their 150th anniversary, I was there to celebrate that and mention Aunt Clarine Coffin Grenfell. Now I got it in there.
Very good.
Little did you know about Aunt Clarine.
I think actually you told me about
Oh.
her once before.
I think you've told me about a million
times.
I actually met Clarine, and
Yeah, we had her for
I heard
dinner
her
once. She came
spiel,
over
and
to.
was quite impressive. And she's quite a very glib speaker, and orator, and a poet as well.
Yes.
And a member of the Methodist Church who I think knew Jake Lewis.
Oh yes, well the
Who was
family
a
went way
historic
back.
figure in town. As a businessman, he pitched baseball for UConn, and he was also he was a politician, big time. When I first came on the scene in the Democratic Party, Jake was the chairman emeritus, and he made sure that I followed his protocols as chairman, and I did that and then some. And but it wasn't easy between the two of us. We were both strong-willed, but we got things done. And as I recall, he was a member of that. It's interesting because I'd never thought about that, but he was a member of that church up on 195 that moved out of Willimantic to Mansfield, as you pointed out, Jamie, that I did not know. I think I'm going to hear a lot of stuff I didn't know.
I think we
So-
are, yes.
Let's continue with that.
Okay. Yes, indeed.
Okay, so the Methodists in this part of Connecticut, when they formed, they were the anti-slavery abolitionist church. Most places it was the Quakers, and because of the equality of all people is fundamental to Quaker belief, although the Quaker church was not initially an anti-slavery church, it became one as time. But eventually the Methodist church becomes one as well. It's a newer church than the Quaker church. So it wasn't just in Windham. It's first Methodist circuit riders arrived in the early 19th century, and they included abolitionism among their sermons. And so they attracted people who tended to be social activists and still do. Because John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, was a social activist, and you see him still quoted today. The two people I want to focus on, I think, are local heroes, and they're Orrin Robinson and his wife Jerusha Robinson. And Orrin Robinson, the Robinson family is one of the oldest families in Windham. They go back to among the very first that arrived in the late 1600s. And it was a big family, and there were many Robinsons, and most of them were farmers, and they owned farms along what's now Jackson Street, on out to, one of their houses was the stone house that it's at the corner of Jackson Street, and Ash Street was one of their farmhouses. But Orrin was not a farmer, he was a miller. So where the big mills are today, the big, huge granite mills that are down on the Willimantic River, they hadn't really been built yet. And so in the 1830s, and a little bit earlier than that as well, where the big number 2 mill is that was built in the 1860s, the big granite building that's down there, there was a sawmill and a grist mill and some other small mills that were there. And the sawmill and grist mill were run by Orrin Robinson. He owned them and he ran them. And he was referred to by people locally fondly as Uncle Orrin, and his wife Jerusha as Aunt Rushi. And they had a smallish house right across the street. It's on what's now Main Street on the north side, not too far from where the Mill Museum is now, a little bit further on down towards Cardinal Square and Recreation Park. So they lived there as middle-class people, well known for running the mill. So what happens is the Methodist Church is established, and Orrin and Rushi are among those who join it. Mostly not the movers and shakers, not the wealthy people in town, but they did join. But it was an anti-slavery church, and so the minister invited an abolitionist speaker to come in 1837. Invited him to come in and talk to the congregation. And there are two accounts of the what I call the Methodist melee on Main Street, and that's my attempt to be literary. And one is by Lloyd Baldwin. And Lloyd Baldwin was an early inhabitant. He came as a carpenter to build not one of the big mills that's still there, but one of the Bridge Street mills, one of the granite mills that was on Bridge Street. And he came as an apprentice and stayed. He ended up building a lot of the old buildings that were located in Willimantic. Were his constructions. Franklin Hall, he built that. He built several of the mill buildings. He built churches. He built private homes. He became the preeminent builder, and he lived until the 1890s. In the 1890s, as an old man, a widower, his wife dead, I think his son is even dead by then, he no longer lived in his big mansard roof house on Pleasant Street, but he lived in one of the hotels, the Wyndham House Hotel, which is where Liberty Bank is located today. So he's living there. And for one of the local newspapers, not the Chronicle, but the other one that we had, daily newspapers, he wrote a series of articles called Willimantic, before 1850. And in it, he wants to do the history of the community, but as a builder, he went building by building and then talked about who lived in those buildings.
Wow, that's
and
impressive.
It's a wonderful early history, and it exists because it was printed in the newspaper, and the Journal was the name of the newspaper. And then somebody did a typed transcript that was put on our local library, and I've copied it out and put it onto the Mill Museum's website so it can easily be read by everybody. This is where I first heard this story. It's a spare account, and Lloyd Baldwin had mixed feelings about Robinson, about Orrin Robinson, because they were affiliated with different political parties. Orrin Robinson was a Whig, and Lloyd Baldwin was a Jacksonian Democrat. And as a Jacksonian Democrat, he wasn't very sympathetic to abolitionism because the Democrats,
least, right?
the Democrats were the conservative party back then. They didn't want to change things like that. Their fear was any abolitionist movement could undermine the Union, cause secession and eventual civil war. And of course, they were right. That's exactly what did happen. So they didn't like this abolitionist talk. But Baldwin liked Orrin Robinson, because he was an honest man who stood up for what he believed in. And so that was respectable at the time. He respected him greatly. So he does a very short version. And then there's a longer version by Alan Lincoln, who would be a Republican after the Civil War. Lincoln was actually really our first real full local historian, and he did an oration. And when they said orations in the 1800s, they meant orations. They would go on for hours. And he did one on the bicentennial of the town of Wyndham, and he includes this story in it. And it's got more details in it than Baldwin's version, but some of the details are wrong. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. So these are the two primary source accounts that we have for what happened. So we've got the minister has invited in a person that Lincoln actually said was Aaron Phelps, but I can't find any abolitionist named Aaron Phelps. But there was an Amos Phelps, so I think it's Amos, who's from Connecticut, then later moved to Massachusetts and became very involved with the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and the National Anti-Slavery Society. He was a moderate abolitionist. He didn't want to push too much, so he crossed swords with William Lloyd Garrison, who was the radical one. They didn't disagree on things very, very often. But it was Amos, this moderate abolitionist who wants a slow, more gradual abolitionism. Connecticut had already had abolitionism. Connecticut had outlawed slavery in Connecticut, but it was a slow, gradual abolitionism. We would not finally have the end of slavery totally in Connecticut until 1848. That's a long, long time, when the legislature finally said that there's maybe about a dozen slaves left in Connecticut. Let's call all this off right now.
Because it was birth, right?
Yeah, so the original law said that it freed anybody who was born of a slave mother when they reached first their 25th birthday and then they lowered it to their 20th. As of 1787 was the date the law went. I think not 87. The year before, 86, I think, is the year the law went into effect. But that's gradual. Think that if you're just a newborn at that time, that's going to be a long time before you get to be free. Unlike Massachusetts, which did it by court, the Massachusetts Supreme Court outlawed slavery in Massachusetts in the late 1780s, before the current U.S. Constitution, by saying it was a violation of the Massachusetts Constitution, which guaranteed equal rights to everybody. And so they just simply said, well, it says equal rights in the Constitution. And Vermont, actually, when it came in as a state, outlawed slavery in its constitution expressly. So they're earlier than Connecticut. Connecticut dragged its feet and took a while to really get around to do it. So it's a very gradual abolitionism because they didn't want to interfere with the property rights of people who owned other people, which is an awful thing.
Terrible thing. It's in a lot of the older deeds and the properties as well that we had to pass laws in. More recently to make sure that those kinds of things are out of the the real estate deeds.
Restrictive covenants.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And African Americans don't get voting rights even as free people in Connecticut until after the Civil War with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which made the Connecticut Constitution, which said white people only, white men only, and made it a dead letter on the issue of race. So anyway, that's how far back we're going in time. So the Robinsons joined this church. Phelps has been invited to speak, and there were people locally who didn't like it at all. My guess is Lloyd Baldwin was one of the people who didn't like it at all, but he didn't believe anybody should have done anything about it. This is what he said. Some people did. And so the first night that Phelps spoke, nobody did anything. The second time, he spoke once a week for 3 weeks in a row. Second week, a mob of anti-abolitionists. I'm not saying pro-slavery because probably most of them didn't want slavery in Connecticut, but they didn't like this abolitionism. This is too dangerous. Gathered outside the Methodist Church and threw rocks through the windows.
Oh boy!
And
that is really interesting. I've heard about the way that people think of abolitionists and non-abolitionists, and it's really interesting to think of them as people that didn't want the conflict; they just didn't want to have a change.
Yeah. So Noah Webster actually was one of the people behind Connecticut's abolitionist law outlawing slavery, that gradual law. Webster fought for that in Connecticut, but he was against abolitionism when it was aimed on a national level because he thought it would lead to a civil war.
Right.
So, I mean, there were lots of people who felt, and not just Democrats, because Webster was a Federalist and then a Whig.
So let's throw rocks at that's violence to stop other violence coming.
Yep, well, that's
Basically, that's what
Well, it
is.
got worse.
That's a good
The
point.
next week.
Excellent
I'm
point.
sure.
So the next week, a mob, mostly of tough young men, probably armed with clubs, maybe with guns. Nobody says, but guns were legal and they could have had them. They stormed into the church, led by a man named Charles Schofield, who was in his 20s. Young man. So these are strong, tough young men. Burst into the church just as Phelps is ready to start speaking, and they storm up to the pulpit at the beginning, and it's like, "You shut up." "Well, I don't. Well, you're going to shut up." There's sort of this back and forth, and they threaten to beat up Phelps, drag him out of the pulpit where he's going to speak, to beat him up, and what's going to happen. So I want to set the scene. Because just imagine this. So you've got these tough young men all hopped up because they're all ready for this. So they're all full of anger and fury as they come in.
Maybe
and then you've
a little
got
alcohol.
maybe, and then you've got the church people who aren't ready for this because they didn't know it was going to happen, and because the gang had gathered at the Congregational Church and then marched over to the Methodist Church. So you got church people, right? Probably mostly women, because women are more likely to be church people. A lot of older people there. Kids would have been part of all of this audience. They're there, and suddenly they're being threatened. And so you would think normally they would back down or try to negotiate or something like that. But that's not what happens. What happens is Orrin Robinson gets up out of his pew, and he's 46 years old, and that doesn't sound old to us today, but 46 was getting on in years back at this time. So you've got this much older guy goes up to Schofield, a much younger, tough, angry young man who might have been armed, and grabs him by his arm, marches him down the aisle, probably a frog march, probably the arm, I think, behind the back, one of those things, and throws him out on the main street.
Oh.
And at that point, a fist fight broke out in the church as the church people fight with the thugs, the toughs. And it's in the church, in the pews, they're fighting, and it spills out onto Main Street. And I think it spilled out onto Main Street by design, because while the fight is going on, Aunt Rushi tosses her cloak over Phelps so nobody knows who he is. She's put her cloak over him, leads him out the back door and through the back streets of Willimantic to her house for safety. But that took courage to go that distance, because she doesn't know who's going to be waiting for her outside.
Sure.
So she's as heroic as her husband in this. So what happens is the fist fight on Main Street comes to the attention of the authorities. You can imagine that happened. They got on Facebook is what happened. And it got announced right away. So what happens is the deputy sheriff, who, Lincoln says is a William Hosmer, but I can't find a William Hosmer. So I think it was Stephen Hosmer, who owned Hosmer Mountain. He was a big farmer at the time. I think it was him. Comes on over with one of the constables and maybe more, because Willimantic had just become a borough, so it had constables, and they break up the fight. And they read them the Riot Act, literally read them this, because this is what you did. You would read the Riot Act. It was a written thing you would read and say, you are now under arrest unless you agree to pay a fine and go home. So they arrested like 10, 15 of the ringleaders on both sides, and so they all paid a fine. They all sheepishly reached into their pockets and paid a fine, as the deputy sheriff is saying, you know better than to be fighting in the street. Come on, what is the matter with you? You're grown-ups. Stop this kind of thing. Except for Warren Robinson, and he's just incredulous. Pay a fine for defending my right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and defending Phelps's rights to speak freely, which he has a right to do, and the church has a right to invite him. I am not paying a fine for defending my rights. Take me to jail.
Oh, so he went to court?
Hosmer has no choice. He has to take the jail. It's not a local jail. There's only the county jail at this time in Brooklyn.
Oh, my goodness.
So they start off. This is the one that Prudence Crandall had been in 4 years earlier.
Oh, that's
years before
so
that.
interesting.
It's the same jail.
Oh, my goodness.
That building's still there, right?
Yes,
Isn't
it
it? It's
is,
the town
yes.
hall in Brooklyn.
Yes,
Yeah,
it is.
So
been there many times.
that's a real historic building.
It is.
And
Great
so
location, too.
so they start walking, and Hosmer is thinking, one, I don't want to walk to Brooklyn, and two, he's thinking, I don't want to arrest this guy. I mean, these families have known each other for generations. They're friends. I don't want to arrest him. I just wanted to break up the fight. So what happens is Hosmer starts to pat himself and say, oh, I forgot the paperwork. I left the papers back in Willamette. I have to go get the papers. You can wait for me here if you want while I go get the papers. Now, we all know what he's really saying, right?
Right.
Go home is what he is saying.
The speech? Is that
Well,
the
he-
speech?
No, this
He
is
doesn't quite say it, but
this is
it's-
legal papers
Oh,
that would have
okay.
been involved with the arrests.
Oh,
That-
okay.
marking off that they
I
had read
see.
the Riot Act and followed the
Oh,
law.
all right, the Riot Act.
Yeah, so he goes back, gets whatever papers, if indeed he actually had forgotten papers,
Right.
and thinks, well, I better check on what's going on.
How far out were they when he?
I don't know,
wondered
but
that.
I
I'd
don't
love to know that.
I don't think
It's a
it's
long way.
really very far that
Couldn't
they
have
had
been.
got. But what happens?
in
Hosmer
great
gets
shape.
himself a horse, so he rides his horse just to see what's
Oh,
going on,
okay.
and overtakes Orrin Robinson, marching himself to jail. And so he walked the whole way with the horse going next to him with Osmond, all the way to jail where he was committed to jail. Now, I would like to know how he got out of jail, but that's not in any of the record. Nobody wrote this down. I did hear sort of an oral version that got floated around that said that he refused to leave the jail cell, Robinson. He wouldn't pay his fine, refused to leave the jail cell until finally the jailers said, well, we're going to just take you out of here, push you out. So he sat down in a chair and held onto the chair. So they had to pick up the chair and carry it out and put him in that square in the middle of Brooklyn. So
Wow.
that's
Determination.
so that might have happened that way.
I'm
I
going
don't.
to be a martyr to my cause.
Exactly.
This is what pretty much Thoreau did in Concord. Refused to pay his taxes because it supported the Mexican-American War, which he believed correctly was a war fought to extend slavery, and so was
Yes.
put in jail for it. And then in Thoreau's case, what happened to somebody? Some people think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Most people think it was his aunt. Came down and paid his fine for him. And Thoreau was so mad because they let him out of jail, because his idea was he was going to stay there as a protest. And that's pretty much really what Robinson had intended. He's going to stay in jail as a protest. But that's 10 years before Thoreau. He's Thoreau before Thoreau. If he had only written the essay Civil Disobedience, we could be celebrating him today. So he is one of he and Rushy, they're heroes,
Yes, absolutely.
I think. And Orrin Robinson lives until 1864. That's when he dies. So fairly old age at the time. He and Rushy had known sorrow. Their daughter had died before this event. Their son is around, but he just works as a laborer. And I suspect, reading between the lines, that he wasn't the sharpest tack in the box kind of a guy. But he lives with his parents. He never got married. And at the time of the melee, Rushy's elderly mother also lived with them as well. Rushy came also from a long family. Her father's name was Abel, but her mother's maiden name was Lyman. We still have tons of Lymans around.
Sure.
Well, my friend Bev Lyman York is a Lyman. That's how long
Yeah.
they're still
boy.
here. The
I
Lymans.
didn't know that.
So
I knew it was Beverly L.
yeah, it's a Lyman. So these are really old families that go way
Sure.
back. So anyway, I know where they're buried, and in the old Willimantic Cemetery. And Orrin's gravestone is still upright. Rushy's and their daughter Charlotte's have fallen over. I'd like to actually get a project to write them back up again, because I think they deserve to be.
Sure.
She's a hero.
Yeah, so again, they're
Yeah,
marble stones. They could be righted. They're in the old part of the cemetery where normal people are buried, just little stones, not where all those big grand monuments to mill owners and things were. But they're there. I visit them from time to time. I like to tell Orrin how it's going. I went to see him because I wanted to tell him I'd used his name. So this was in 2017 in Charlottesville, North Carolina, Virginia,
It was
Charlottesville,
around that
Virginia.
time.
Right, 2017, I think,
Yeah.
when the thugs marched through town and
Right.
people stood up to them.
Yes.
And we had a vigil on the square here in town, on Gilson Square.
Yes, we
And
did.
several people asked, what would we do if something like this happened? And I thought to myself, I know what we would have done once. We stood up to them all those years in the past and could do that again. And that's when I wrote up this as a story for the first time. And it was published in Neighbors.
That's
and
great.
it's now on the Mill Museum's website.
Wonderful. We'll have to share that as well.
Yeah.
I think we're going to break now. This is Susan Johnson. I'm here with our wonderful guest, historian Jamie Eves, his wife Kit Eves, who does great things in town, and my co-host Dennis O'Brien. We will be right back after these messages.
Hey, welcome back. This is Dennis O'Brien here with our co-host Susan Johnson and very special guest. Talk about another couple in town who has done so much for the town. And gee, did I include us in that? I don't know. I guess I did, but inadvertently or implicitly. Jamie Eves and Kit Eves. And Jamie has just given us a really, really great story, a true story, about the history of Willimantic and the area, and talking about abolitionism, if that's a word.
It is.
Okay, you would know. I would not. Anyway, let's get back to it. Jamie, you have some more things to cover?
I just wanted a couple of things to finish up with.
Yeah.
The story of the Methodist melee on Main Street. So, Orrin Robinson, I told you, I went on, I told him about our day that we had our vigil. But Orrin Robinson didn't live to see the end of the Civil War. He died in 1864, and the war ended in 1865. He didn't live to see the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery in the United States. But by dying in 1864, he did live long enough to witness the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued by Lincoln, the final version, in January 1st of 1863. So I imagine he had this good thing that he was able to enjoy, at the very end of his life, and was a nice capstone for him. So he's one of several people I go and tell how things are going that are in our local cemeteries. So I just wanted to just point that out.
Well, that is wonderful, and I've been on the tour with you when you've told people. We went with the NAACP at one point in time, and you went on the tour pointing out all of these people and really telling us the history. But this is really something I hadn't really realized about this massacre, this fight that occurred with the Methodist Church, and how the Methodists were abolitionists, which is really a great thing for my family history, and to have them arguing and fighting, and the perspective of the people who were going through these times, trying to make things better for our country. It's really very, very important that we keep these things in mind, because it really was, we call it slavery, but in another way, when I look at it and think about it today, maybe you can correct me, but it seemed like fascism for black people.
Well, fascism hadn't been invented yet, so it's kind of ahistorical to use something like that.
Yeah, we use that word pretty loosely, Susan.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, he says, he's right, you're right.
So, fascism is a 20th century invention.
Sure.
Yeah.
But
He's got Chris Files' book about
Haunted
fascism.
by Hitler.
Chris Files.
Haunted by Hitler.
Haunted by Hitler.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about fascism. And anyway,
Yeah.
we're being distracted. We're
Yeah,
moving
we're moving away
too
from it.
too late in history.
But we think about oppression, and in some ways, slavery still exists in some countries today.
yeah,
Well,
oppression and exploitation are great terms
yeah,
Thank you.
for it.
and they're
Tend to be
unfortunately
growing in our country right now.
in the world.
Well,
in
the
our country,
oppression and
our country for sure. I was really interested in the notion that young men were leading the charge in terms of trying to shut up the
Well,
speaker.
Baldwin said that they were encouraged by older men who knew better.
Well, I think that's happening today.
Well, some things are in human behavior are kind of
Never
constants.
change.
People can behave badly in all eras, and then
I
people
had,
can rise to great heights.
I had
in all eras.
professors in English lit classes that I took that said, one thing you learn from literature and from history is that human beings do not change much over time. The nature of man, as they call it, nature of mankind, humankind, hasn't changed that much.
No, when you talk about progress in history, it's mostly technological progress.
Yeah.
Is what can be
If you want to
talked
call it that.
Well,
it is technological progress, but what the effects of it are.
from a physicist's point of view,
right.
or an engineer's.
Good.
Yeah, but no, human nature is human nature.
Yeah.
But the thing that always has been important to me in my study of history is you also find the heroes. You find the people who did the right thing. I had a professor once.
And a lot of them are not well known.
No, they're not,
and that's what you're doing here.
that's a shame.
Yeah,
I had a
yeah.
professor once who tried to get us as a class, don't be too hard on people who lived in the past. That's just the way it was back then. And I said, no, I can find at least one person in almost any era who stood up against stuff like
Right.
that. So there are people who stood up against slavery. There are people who were decent to other people. There are decent people in almost every era. They're often outnumbered, but but they're there. And those are the people we should be remembering. Those are the people we should be making statues of.
And the opportunity was there too, because there were a lot fewer people. Life was harder in some ways. It's hard to judge that, but it was simpler, and we didn't have all these things. If you were a farmer, your week was pretty much set up for you. You worked from sun up to sundown, and women worked, constantly, even more.
it was harder, but for them, they didn't realize it was harder.
No.
They didn't know what the future was going to be, and
Absolutely.
that we would have indoor toilets, and we would have electricity, and things
and
like
the
that.
40-hour work week,
And,
or 35, or whatever it is.
yeah.
Yep. That's
women,
right.
Women could vote, and
Oh, that was a little later.
a little later, yeah.
Well, that's one of the great things I think about being a historian is you really appreciate that perspective and how much different things were, and and when people try to judge one area against another, and like you say, there are heroes. There are always heroes. There are always people who.
So the heroes and villains
well-
need to be evaluated
Yeah.
in the context
In
of
the
their own
context-
time.
in the context of their times,
obviously,
yes.
but
I want to make sure
don't
we
say
also,
they were all bad.
I want to also, we are saying heroes, but I'm thinking that we had heroines.
Oh yeah.
And,
Of course.
and none of us have said
There's
that
probably
word.
more of them,
Well,
like there are today.
When I think about the women who went to jail and were force fed because they went on hunger strikes because they wanted the right to vote,
Sure.
those are heroines. And I think about people who are now trying to decide what we're going to do now that we've lost Roe v. Wade, and what's going to happen in our country with that. Will there be heroes? Will there be heroines? About women having the right to their own bodies and their own bodies' uses.
There will be. It all depends. I think the only thing in doubt is how effective will it be? How long will it take?
Yeah.
Well, the
That's-
application in that circumstance is a right to health care for all
Everybody.
aspects of your physiological being, and whether you're a woman or a man. If you can deny women access to all the different types of modern inventions in healthcare with reproductive rights and those types of things, that is really healthcare. So we can get into those types of situations, but I think that we
It
want
sounds like a big digression.
That is a big.
We only
that'll
have
be big, and
so
we wanna
much
make
time,
sure
and we have
the access for everybody, but
I
We
the
have
just want to
Kit
make
and
sure we
Jamie here.
say heroines, that's all.
heroines and
Yeah,
that's right.
well,
Women are
I'm
are
mindful of
fighters
that.
as well, So yes.
I think women are all heroines that are having to put up with their lot in life vis-a-vis men historically and in the present time. Although you have made progress, but it's
We
still
have, and
there's
lots
still a
and
long
lots
way
of
to go, baby.
wonderful men that really work hard and make sure the families are well cared for, and the women work hard with the families, and they make sure that the families are well cared for,
Oh.
and they make a nice society. If we only give everybody a chance in the society, I think we'll be doing very well. That's what we got to be fighting
You
for.
like to
Everybody
listen.
give the chance.
Yes,
Give the chance to do
sounds good.
do the good
Jamie,
job.
anything you want to add to your your discussion
'Cause we
of the
digress.
melee,
Yeah, I'm sorry, I did.
the Methodist melee on Main Street?
So
That's
good.
pretty.
But yeah, that's an amazing thing, and to think it was right here. Refresh our recollection again on exactly where that Methodist church was.
This is about where the old Hurley's department store is located, right around in there.
Right in there.
So all they had to do was go around the corner when they built their, because it was a temporary building they were in first, and then then they built their new one on Church Street, which they had for a very, very long period of time.
And this was before the town hall was built.
Oh, much longer
yeah.
before the town hall.
Yeah, because it's
1890s, right?
1890s for the town hall, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first churches in Windham were, of course, in Windham Center.
Yep.
But in Willimantic, the Congregational Church, which was also originally on Main Street and then got moved, was the first one. And they had then a Universalist church for a while.
Oh,
I didn't know that.
The building is still there. It's the Shoesmith.
oh, really?
That building
My goodness,
that's
the
a church.
Universalist church.
That was and I'm told, I haven't been in to see it, you can go up into the attic if John Walker will let you go up there, and you can actually see some of the architecture of when that was a church. There was a whole neighborhood down where the mills are now that they tore down to make the mills. So we think that Chilson Square is the only example of urban renewal. So this is urban renewal circa 1850s, 1860s. They tore down, all that area where, the American Thread was to make American Thread. To put that, there are streets that no longer exist. The neighborhood was called Old State after State Street, which was the central street that went down it. There was a school that was down there that got torn down. Lots of shops, stores, residences, small factories, the grist mill and the sawmill that we talked about earlier. And on the location where the Mill Museum is now was originally a saloon.
Oh,
but
salute.
but the general manager of the Willimantic Linen Company, as American Thread was called in the late 1800s, was he was a teetotaler, and absolutely did not like watching his workers leave work and head for the saloon. So he bought it, tore it down, and built the building that's there now as a company store, so the company could recapture wages from workers by selling them things on credit.
Is that the building that's empty next to the old, American Thread?
No, this is what's the Mill Museum.
Oh, that's the Mill Museum now.
The Mill Museum
What
now.
about that empty building that's a stone building and it's empty and people always have ideas about what to do with it?
Oh, that was their office building.
Oh, okay.
So yes, so when he looked out his office window,
I see.
Yes, that's the office window he looked out of and saw people going into the saloon.
What a cool spot for him
Yeah.
to manage things.
Monitor.
Yeah, they outgrew that as office space, though. And then the other
It's
stone
small.
building
It's
that's
small,
down
but,
there
but,
is,
but it's a good spot.
it is a good
But
spot.
For those days, I'm sure it was great.
We're running down on time, but I just wanted to you said that the Congregational Church was on Main Street. Do you whereabouts? Was
I
it?
have forgotten where that was. I'd have to look that up.
Oh, sorry.
Lloyd Baldwin has all of that information.
All right.
But yeah, and so he tells the story of how the current one got built, and he's upset because he wasn't hired to be the builder. So he then tells how the landowner swindled the Congregationalists by overcharging them for the land it was built on.
See, some things never change.
Wow.
Even in those times, building a church.
Yeah.
Very, very good. We're running down to our last couple of minutes. Why don't you give us a little bit more about, summary and, about where to find more stuff and that sort of thing.
Well, if you're looking for local history, the easiest place to find it is on the website of the Mill Museum, which is www.millmuseum.org. So it's really easy to remember. And if you go into the home page, which is where that will take you, there's a menu at the very top, a banner menu, and it says History is one of the things. And if you click on History, it will take you to a whole bunch of pages with a whole bunch of history articles. If you're going on your phone, there's no banner, so you have to drop down, and there'll be some boxes you can choose. But there's a box labeled History, and if you click on that, it'll take you to the history pages that are there. Or you can buy Tom Beardsley's wonderful History of Willimantic that he wrote in the early 90s, which really pretty much ends at the beginning of the 20th century, but lots of good information before that.
And we have
That's
for
there.
sale at the Mill Museum.
And we do. And what we need is more written history of the rest of Windham to go along with that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's great. And I want to just put a plug in for the Mill Museum. Everybody go online and become a member for the Mill Museum because we want to have more membership. It does great things for the
Absolutely.
community and has great information on it. So I think it's a great thing for everybody to do. And thank you so much for the amazing work you do, Jamie. You have done
Thank you.
amazing work for the history of our town, and it really gives us a sense of community that I don't think we would have without you. So I really appreciate your work. And I appreciate your work too as well. Kit Eves, Jamie Eves, thank you both for being with us this evening.
Good to see
Thank
you
you for
both.
having me.
Yes.